September 25th, 1978. A beautiful morning in San Diego. Clear skies, perfect weather. The kind of day you'd remember forever. And 144 people are about to die in the next 60 seconds. A Boeing 727 airliner is descending toward the runway. It carries 135 passengers and crew. Everything is normal. Everything is routine. But hidden in the blind spot directly below the jet, a tiny Cessna training plane is climbing through the same airspace. Neither pilot knows the other is there. The tower controller sees it coming on radar. A red blinking warning light screams. But by the time anyone says a word, it's already too late. At 9:02 and 7 seconds, two aircraft collide at 2,600 feet over a peaceful San Diego neighborhood. The impact is catastrophic. The Cessna shatters instantly. The massive Boeing's right wing catches fire. Both planes plummet. They crash directly into homes where families are eating breakfast. The explosion creates a mushroom cloud visible for miles. When the smoke clears, 144 people are gone. But here's the shocking part. This disaster should have been impossible to miss. The real failure wasn't what everyone was watching in the sky. It was 3 hidden errors buried deep in the system. And those errors almost cost even more lives. Let me show you exactly how this happened. This is the story of Pacific Southwest Airlines, or PSA. In the 1970s, PSA was California's favorite airline. Bright orange planes, playful designs. They flew short routes between California cities. Passengers loved them. Pilots wanted to work for them. The airline had never had a fatal crash in its history. September 25, 1978, started like any other day. The captain of Flight 182 was James McFerrin. He had flown for PSA for 17 years. He had over 14,000 flight hours. He was experienced and careful. First Officer Robert Fox was flying the plane that morning, handling the controls as they descended into San Diego. The plane carried 128 passengers, families heading home, business travelers, a few PSA employees. The flight from Sacramento to Los Angeles had been smooth. Now they were heading south for a short 30-minute flight to San Diego's Lindbergh Field. Meanwhile, 6 miles north at Montgomery Field, a small Cessna 172 was preparing for a training flight. This tiny plane was nothing like the massive 727. A Cessna 172 is a 4-seater prop plane. It weighs 2,100 pounds. The 727 weighs 110 tons. The Cessna pilot was David Boswell, a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant who was learning to fly on instruments. His instructor was an experienced pilot named Martin Casey Jr. These two aircraft were about to share the same patch of sky. The system supposed to keep them apart was supposed to work. Radar tracked both planes. Radio frequencies kept pilots talking to controllers. There were procedures, rules, safety systems built on top of safety systems. And yet, none of it worked. Now here's where things get really interesting. At 8:59 in the morning, the San Diego approach controller told Flight 182 there was a small Cessna in the area. The PSA captain replied calmly, "We know about that." The controller said, "Traffic at 12 o'clock and 3 miles. That means directly ahead, 3 miles away." But here's the problem. They weren't really looking. The Cessna was climbing. The 727 was descending. They were on nearly the same heading, but the bigger plane was coming from behind and above. From the cockpit of Flight 182, the Cessna would have appeared to be standing still. It blended into the background of the city below. Pilots call this ground clutter. When you're flying over buildings and streets, you see hundreds of shapes and edges. Your brain has to find the one moving object that matters. The Cessna didn't move relative to the background. It looked like a building. It looked like a shadow. The captain said, "We've got him." But they didn't.
I don't see him now.
Not really. They said they saw him. They thought they were tracking him. But the Cessna had already moved out of where they last spotted it. The captain told the first officer, "I saw him about 1 o'clock, probably behind us now." He was right about it being behind them, but behind meant the tiny plane was still directly below them, invisible in that deadly blind spot. The human eye can't easily see things that don't move against a background. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a fundamental problem with how aviation safety worked in 1978. The system relied on pilots seeing each other. It was called see and avoid. But on that clear, sunny morning, perfect visibility didn't matter. You could see for 10 miles. You could see the mountains. You could see the ocean. But you couldn't see the one airplane that mattered, because it wasn't moving across your field of vision. The first officer asked a question that would echo through history. "Are we clear of that Cessna?" The flight engineer answered, "Supposed to be." And the captain said something terrifying. "I guess." They didn't know. They thought they saw the Cessna. They believed it was behind them. But that belief was wrong. And they were descending directly toward it. The Cessna pilot, meanwhile, had been given instructions by the tower to fly a heading of 070 degrees. But the small plane drifted. It went off course. The pilot didn't catch the drift in time. This tiny navigation error, maybe 1 or 2 degrees, put the Cessna exactly where the 727 would be a few minutes later. But if you think that's crazy, wait until you hear this. The controller's radar screen was beeping. A computer detected the conflict. 2 aircraft were going to be too close. The safety warning flashed automatically. This was the system's chance to fix the problem. The controller saw the warning. He called the Cessna and said, "Traffic in your vicinity. A PSA jet has you in sight. He's descending for Lindbergh." The message sounded reassuring. It meant, in theory, that the problem was solved. The 727 pilots had reported seeing the Cessna, so the controller believed they could keep themselves apart visually. But the Cessna pilot never acknowledged that transmission. The radio call was made, but nobody confirmed they heard it. The Cessna pilot was busy. He was concentrating. Maybe he didn't register the words. Maybe the radio wasn't clear. It doesn't matter. The warning went unheard. Nobody on the ground noticed. The controller should have told the Lindbergh Tower about the conflict alert. That's protocol. The tower controller could have given clear, direct instructions. PSA Flight 182, the Cessna is directly below you, 500 feet below. That exact information would have saved everyone. But the San Diego approach controller didn't pass the warning up. He assumed the PSA pilots had it handled. This assumption was the critical failure. Inside the 727's cockpit, the pilots kept discussing where the Cessna was. Their confusion is recorded on the voice recorder. "He was right over there a minute ago," the captain said. "Is he still in sight?" someone asked. "There's one underneath," the first officer said. They knew something was in that space. They felt uncertain, but they didn't ask for clarification from the tower. And then the first officer called for the landing gear to come down. They were committed now. They were descending faster. They were focusing on landing procedure, not on finding the small plane they couldn't see. The Cessna, meanwhile, was still climbing. It was still drifting off its assigned heading. The two aircraft were now in a collision course that neither pilot could prevent. The system had multiple chances to stop this. The controller could have kept them separated using radar vectors. He could have told the Cessna to stay at 1,500 feet. He could have told the 727 to level off at 3,000 feet. But those instructions were never given. The system defaulted to see and avoid, the weakest link in aviation safety. And the see part had failed completely. This brings us to the most shocking discovery of all. At 9:01 and 47 seconds, the 727 was in a 15-degree left turn at 2,600 feet. The Cessna was climbing on a northeast heading. The two flight paths crossed at exactly the same point, at exactly the same time. The 727's nose wheel struck the Cessna's fuselage. The impact was at 175 miles per hour. The Cessna shattered instantly. The plane broke in half. Fuel from the ruptured tanks ignited. A fireball erupted. The Cessna's remains tumbled down, eventually crashing 6 blocks away. 2 men, both experienced pilots, died before they understood what happened. But that was only the beginning of the catastrophe. The collision tore a 5-foot hole in the 727's right wing. The impact severed hydraulic lines. The plane immediately became difficult to control. Flight engineer Martin Wanna swore in the cockpit. Captain McFerrin said quietly, "Easy, baby. Easy, baby." But there was no easy solution. The Boeing was damaged too severely. The pilots fought for control for just 2.5 seconds. They knew something terrible had happened. They knew they had hit something. But they didn't know what or where the damage was. The right wing was on fire. The plane was rolling uncontrollably. It descended nearly 3,000 feet in those final seconds. At 9:02 and 7 seconds, the Boeing's right wing struck a house at 3,611 Nile Street. The impact velocity was 260 knots. The aircraft hit nose down, banking 50 degrees to the right. The 110-ton airliner came down at a 45-degree angle. The wing with its burning fuel tore through homes. It lodged in the wall of one house. Debris scattered across an entire neighborhood. 135 people died on the aircraft. 12 people died on the ground. Families were killed while eating breakfast. Children died in the crash zone. 7 people total. Some of the homes were completely destroyed. Charred wood, twisted metal. The smell of burning fuel filled the quiet neighborhood. Fire truck sirens wailed. Within minutes, 60% of the entire San Diego Fire Department was responding. But here's what makes this catastrophe even more shocking. After the collision with the Cessna, the 727 should have been able to land. The damage was severe, but not necessarily fatal. Experienced pilots have recovered from worse. The hydraulic damage was significant. The fire was visible. But if the pilots had known immediately what they were facing, if they had been told by the tower, if they had been given direct guidance on what to do, they might have made it to the runway. Captain McFerrin was a 17-year veteran of PSA. First Officer Fox was highly skilled. Flight Engineer Wanna had over 10,000 hours. These were professional pilots with real experience. They didn't need a miracle. They needed information. They needed the tower to say, "You've collided with a small aircraft. You have damage. Here's your best option." But nobody told them that. Nobody on the ground knew what had happened until it was over. This system failure, this communication breakdown, this is what made the disaster complete. So what does all this mean for us today? The San Diego disaster changed aviation forever, but it didn't change immediately. It took years of investigation. It took anger. It took demands from safety experts that something be done. The core problem was that see and avoid as a safety system didn't actually work. Two planes at different altitudes, both operated by experienced pilots in clear weather, couldn't see each other. The system failed at its most basic level. Aviation experts knew this. They had known it for decades. But nobody had been forced to fix it, because there hadn't been a catastrophic mid-air collision in the United States for a long time. The second problem was air traffic control procedures in 1978. The radar systems existed. The technology was there. But controllers couldn't display all the information pilots needed. The San Diego controller couldn't show the Cessna pilot exactly where the 727 was. He couldn't show the 727 pilots the Cessna's exact altitude and heading. The tools existed to prevent this collision. They just weren't being used effectively. The third problem was communication. The controller gave warnings, but the Cessna pilot didn't acknowledge them. The 727 pilots said they had the Cessna in sight, but they were looking in the wrong place. The system assumed that if someone said they saw something, they actually had it. This assumption was deadly. After the disaster, the FAA did more than issue a report. It fundamentally changed how aircraft get separated around airports. Radar became mandatory for approach control. Display systems improved. Controllers could now see altitude information for every plane. Speed information, real-time tracking. The see and avoid rule became a last resort, not the first defense. But the biggest change came from one piece of technology: collision-avoidance systems, TCAS systems. These are small computers on each aircraft that talk to each other using radar. They warn pilots when another aircraft is getting dangerously close. If pilots don't respond, the system can automatically command the plane to maneuver. Today, no two planes in the same airspace can collide without both pilots and the TCAS system failing. The chance of that happening is nearly zero. Since the PSA disaster, and since the implementation of these systems, there has not been a single mid-air collision in the United States involving a commercial airliner. Not one in nearly 50 years. Before we wrap up, there's one final thing you need to know. The changes made after September 25, 1978, weren't just about airplanes. They influenced technology far beyond aviation. Safety researchers studied why the PSA pilots couldn't see the Cessna. They learned about something called ground clutter, how objects blend into backgrounds when there's no relative motion. They understood blind spots better. They understood attention failure better. In 1991, 13 years after the disaster, a San Diego technology company called IVHS Technologies took these lessons and applied them to cars. They developed something called VORAD, Vehicle Onboard Radar. It was essentially a TCAS system for automobiles. The radar constantly scans ahead for vehicles. If a collision is predicted, the system alerts the driver. If the driver doesn't respond, the system engages the brakes automatically. This technology is now standard on nearly every car sold in the United States. Every Tesla, every BMW, every Ford, every car with collision avoidance. That technology traces its roots back to the PSA disaster. The engineers who designed car safety systems studied the cockpit of Flight 182 and learned how to save lives on highways. It's estimated that anti-collision systems in cars prevent thousands of accidents every year. Thousands of deaths avoided. And it started with a terrible lesson from San Diego. The memorial in North Park lists 144 names. Families who lost loved ones that morning never forgot. A high school student who should have graduated. An elderly couple who were flying to visit grandchildren. A PSA captain with 17 years of perfect flights. A Marine who was learning to fly. 2 dedicated flight attendants. Children. The neighborhood has recovered. New houses were built. The intersection of Dwight and Nile is quiet again. But every pilot who descends into San Diego International Airport flies over that spot. They know the history. They understand what happened. They benefit from the systems that were created to make sure it never happens again. And every driver who hits the highway with modern safety systems activated is also benefiting. They're protected by a lesson purchased with 144 lives. The system works now, not because it's perfect, but because after the worst failure, we finally demanded better. We got it, and we're still learning. 144 people died because of 3 failures working together. Pilots couldn't see what their eyes told them to look for. Air traffic control didn't share crucial information. And a safety system relied on technology that couldn't do its job. But from that tragedy came the safest aviation system in history. Today, your chance of dying in a plane crash is lower than your chance of being struck by lightning. And your chance of being in a collision with another vehicle is lower than it used to be, because of technology born from that terrible morning. If this opened your eyes to how safety systems actually work, or fail, please hit subscribe. We break down real disasters and show you the lessons hidden inside them. Watch our next video on the deadliest aviation accident ever recorded. And tell us in the comments, what part of this story shocked you most?